believer, and this video is a short discussion of leadership and change in complex organizations. This will also serve as the final project for GMPA 763, Leadership and Environment of Administration, for fall 2018 at Gannon University. I've selected the United States Army for this project because I'm familiar with the organization and the rich history of applied leadership. I'm also an ROTC instructor at Gannon University, so it kind of works out. This video will begin with a brief discussion of the history of the United States Army, then we'll go into an assessment of the U.S. Army's culture and its dynamics. Later, I'll discuss the implementation of change by leaders in the organization and finish with some closing thoughts. Much of the discussion is based on the work of Edgar H. Schein, as captured in the book, Corporate Culture Survival Guide, published in 2009 by Josie Bass, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It will also reference several of the assigned readings that we've used in the discussion forums for this class. Lastly, I'll supplement the assessment with personal examples from my experience in the Army. Before diving into the Army's culture, I'd like to provide a quick history of the Army. This will help to define some of the organizational structure and processes, and more importantly, frame the discussion later on. The Army draws its roots from the pre-Revolutionary War Continental Army and the militias that existed prior to the Revolutionary War. In fact, its birth date is June 14, 1775, and the Continental Congress commissioned George Washington as Commander-in-Chief 5 days later. Emblazoned with symbols from the Army's past, 1775 is present on the U.S. Army's official flag, as well as 187 campaign streamers that hang from the top of the staff and denote campaigns fought by the Army throughout our history. Each streamer is embroidered with the designation of a campaign and the year or years that it occurred. Now we'll quickly go through these streamers to establish a general chronological order of Army campaigns. Feel free to stop or pause if you'd like. First, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the American Civil War, the Indian Wars, the War with Spain, the China Relief Expedition, the Philippine Insurrection, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Armed Forces Expeditions, Kosovo, Southwest Asia, the Global War on Terrorism. The modern U.S. Army is arrayed among 27 commands, some of whom draw their lineage to the field armies that existed during the American Civil War. Each command exists to address a specific focus area or geographic location. For example, the U.S. Army Cyber Command exists to combat digital threats that might originate anywhere in the world, and simultaneously there are 6 geographic combatant commands that cover sections of the world. The modern U.S. Army is based on principles of modularity and conglomeration that allow specialty units to deploy as necessary in accordance with the needs of a given mission, which results in an organizational structure that resembles more of a 3-dimensional spiderweb. These are the enlisted ranks of the U.S. Army. According to the U.S. Army's website, enlisted soldiers are the backbone of the Army. They have specific specialties within an Army unit, perform specific job functions, and have the knowledge that ensures the success of their unit's current mission within the Army. These are warrant officer ranks. According to the U.S. Army's website, warrant officers are adaptive technical experts, combat leaders, trainers, and advisors. Through progressive levels of expertise in assignments, training, and education, the warrant officer administers, manages, maintains, operates, and integrates systems and equipment across the full spectrum of operations. These are commissioned officer ranks. According to the U.S. Army's website, commissioned officers are the managers, problem solvers, key influencers, and planners who lead enlisted soldiers in all situations. They plan missions, give orders, and assign soldiers tasks. Lastly, this is a diagram of the general hierarchical structure that exists in regular operational units. The wire diagram on the left displays how each element fits within the one above it. The ranks listed to the right lead the corresponding unit on the left. Now we'll discuss and assess the cultural dynamics of the United States Army. Schein identifies 3 levels of culture: visible artifacts, espoused values, and shared tacit assumptions, going from the visible and obvious features of the organization to the invisible factors known only to those on the inside. The 3 levels attempt to comprehensively explain and capture an organization's culture at a given point in time. They explain how the organization arrived at its current position and critical features to the way the organization operates. Culture in the Army doesn't evolve very quickly. For example, on Veterans Day earlier this month, the Army announced it was going to change the semi-formal dress uniform back to the World War II era tannish green uniform. Soldiers have a tendency to romanticize World War II in that generation, so the announcement was met with enthusiasm and happiness, until they found out the uniforms wouldn't be available for wear until about 2.5 years later. It is also important to note that the Army changes leadership at nearly every level every 2 to 3 years, but the organizational culture of the force generally remains the same. This is likely due to the significant volume of regulations and doctrine that shape the modern Army. From the leader's perspective, this rotation allows leaders to work in positions of varying intensity over a long period of time. This structure is intentional. The more intense assignments are usually known as key development assignments, and the less intense assignments are usually known as broadening opportunities. For example, prior to the Army sending me to Gannon to complete a master's degree, for nearly 2 years I was in command of about 160 soldiers who were responsible for providing worldwide information technology capabilities to a division headquarters of about 1,000 that was partially deployed from Texas through Europe to Afghanistan. Shine defines artifacts as items that are the easiest level to observe when you go into an organization. It is what you see, hear, and feel as you hang around. These items are fairly obvious to identify, and for the Army, consist of things like the Army flag and streamers mentioned previously, various ceremonies, regimental crests, military music, and post-wide bugle calls, hand salutes, and stories of valorous acts. Soldiers wear uniforms, use a vocabulary filled with jargon and acronyms, and generally carry themselves in a respectable manner. On an Army post, you might see displays of vehicles and equipment relevant to the type of unit on that post. On Fort Hood, for example, a post largely consisting of armored cavalry and tankers, there's an outdoor museum filled with tanks and vehicles from World War I and II, Korea, Vietnam, and Desert Storm. At Fort Bragg, a post that has mostly airborne and special operations units, the outdoor displays are usually focused around paratroopers or special forces. When new soldiers arrive to these posts, the artifacts rapidly immerse the soldier in Army culture with the expectation that the soldiers can synthesize their meanings and become a dependable teammate. Espoused values go a bit deeper than visible artifacts and emerge through conversation with insiders. Shine says the first things you learn when you start asking questions is that the organization has certain values that are supposed to create an image of the organization. The Army deliberately identifies its espoused values in two highly circulated standards, the 7 Army Values and the Soldier's Creed. The 7 Army Values are loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. Soldiers receive an identification tag that displays the 7 Army Values when they arrive at their initial entry training. According to the Army's website, in short, the 7 core Army values are what being a soldier is all about. The intent behind these values is to align all soldiers to a set of desired norms and to abandon their previous values. The Army does this because the units contain soldiers from across the country who have different backgrounds and unique beliefs which can get in the way of accomplishing a given mission. The Soldier's Creed, displayed here, includes a subsection known as the Warrior's Ethos. The Creed provides soldiers with a job description of sorts, a verbal guide of what the Army and the U.S. citizenship expects of them. The Warrior's Ethos is often highlighted in the Soldier's Creed and receives special emphasis as the absolute unbreakable tenets, that no matter what, soldiers will always place the mission first, never accept defeat, never quit, and never leave a fallen comrade. Other creeds exist in the Army, like the Ranger Creed, the Creed of the Non-Commissioned Officer, the Infantryman's Creed, and the Airborne Creed. The 7 Army Values in the Soldier's Creed can generally guide soldiers regarding legal and ethical decisions, but the Uniform Code of Military Justice provides a backbone of legal ramifications if soldiers choose to make poor decisions. The Army's official mission statement and vision statement are similarly important. The U.S. Army's role in the Joint Force, meaning the combined forces of the Air Force, Navy, and Army, is land warfare. The mission is to deploy, fight, and win our nation's wars by providing ready, prompt, and sustained land dominance by Army forces across the full spectrum of conflict as part of the Joint Force. The statement is simple and fully explains why the Army exists. The Army Vision Statement and Strategy provides comprehensive guidance to steer the force ahead for the next decade. The document is 11 pages long, but covers nearly every aspect of the Army to include the reserves and National Guard. The third level of culture identified by Shine is shared tacit assumptions, or said differently, an accepted implicit understanding among organization members about the nature of the world and how to succeed in it. When an organization is successful, the general assumption is that there is something that the founders did or some pattern of behavior in the organization that caused that success. Shine mentions the essence of culture is then jointly learned values and beliefs that work so well that they become taken for granted and non negotiable. At this point, they come to function more as a tacit assumptions that become shared and taken for granted as the organization continues to be successful. Some tacit assumptions that exist in the U.S. Army are that all soldiers are loyal to the U.S. Constitution, that regardless of which political party the Commander in Chief claims, soldiers will follow his or her orders, and that we're deployed to fight just wars that will result in a better future. The Army's culture arrived in its current state as a reflection of 243 years of various leaders of the Army and the country. There is a remarkable volume of painstakingly detailed recorded history that exists to reinforce the Army's artifacts, and in the eyes of American citizens, the Army's espoused values are based in virtue. Stories of accomplishment and receiving awards for achievements help reinforce a critical feature of the Army's culture, which is a focus on constant improvement and thus change. Army leaders do their best to try to prepare for the next war, but considering that is unknowable, we occasionally find ourselves practicing for all possible courses of action. As such, change is constant, and simultaneously, there are so many things that remain the same. As you might expect, the consistencies are tied to the three levels of culture. Shine identifies three age-based categories for culture in organizations and change mechanisms, which are startup culture, mature culture, and midlife crisis culture. My assessment is that the U.S. Army best fits the mature culture framework, so we'll discuss that in a few minutes. After that, we'll discuss Shine's three stages of learning and change, and lastly, we'll discuss how the Army implements change from the strategic, operational, and tactical levels. The culture in a mature company is based on the framework of an established organization. The organization's culture is largely assumed, invisible, and deeply entrenched in the structure and processes of the organization. This company is no longer in the startup phase and has more intricate culture that consists of various subcultures and complex values. Shine says that values and assumptions become embedded in organizational structures and processes. As organizations reach maturity, a wholly different set of issues arise because of changes needed. We are now dealing with unlearning and replacing assumptions and values in a system of highly differentiated subcultures that are likely to be both functional in some parts and dysfunctional in other parts. Shine identifies a five-step process, displayed here, that mature organizations use to implement change. I assess the U.S. Army to be a mature organization because its culture is embedded to the extent that a change requires a deliberate process that includes the stages of learning. The stages of learning are displayed here, and they are unfreezing, learning, and refreezing. Unfreezing is, essentially, the force that spurs the organization to change. Learning is the education provided by the organization to ensure all members understand the new culture. Here, organizations need to provide support for employees as they work through the change process. Lastly, refreezing is the internalization phase with the goal that each employee displays acceptance and the new behavior occurs automatically. Implementing change at the highest level of the military and different levels of the Army occur in different ways. At the strategic level, where policymakers institute change to affect national objectives, leaders implement changes through legislative policymaking. An example of this is the repeal of the former Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that allows homosexuals to serve in the military. To implement this change, a series of education events was added to the standard annual sexual harassment and sexual assault training for all soldiers, and policymakers worked with senior leaders in the Army at the Pentagon to discuss the impact to the service. At the operational level, leaders make changes to a specific realm of warfare, like changes to the rules of engagement in Afghanistan or establishing the Army Futures Command in Austin, Texas. These changes are typically implemented at one of the 27 commands that I mentioned earlier. The tactical level of operations usually implies a smaller force. Implementing change here is likely a local solution and is usually not overly complex. An example of this are the command philosophy and policy letters published by a new commander when they assume command of a battalion or a company. I've experienced change in the Army both as the person driving the change and I've also been a receiver of the change. The most recent example I have is in regards to GAN and ROTC's physical training policy. In the past, the policy was that physical training, or PT, would take place from 5:45 a.m. to 7 a.m. on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, simultaneously at Gandon University, Mercyhurst University, and Penn State Behrend. We identified that the evaluation process could be changed to provide better physical fitness sessions for our cadets and better leadership opportunities for our more senior cadets. To implement the change, we had to gain buy-in from fellow cadre, then educate the cadets on the new policy. Together, the cadre asked for honest feedback from the cadets, we discussed possible issues and solutions, and we provided continuous support through the process of implementing the new policy. The end result was positive, and we seem to be getting the results we expected. A couple concluding thoughts. It's important to remember that culture will exist regardless of whether someone takes the initiative to lead or not, and that leaders guide culture by publicizing intent and then being consistent in their convictions. The U.S. Army's culture is derived from more than 200 years of existence and more than 190 identified combat and peacekeeping missions. Each subordinate command within the Army enjoys the opportunity to establish its own subclimate. For some commanders, this is easier than others based on their individual capabilities to assess and implement change. Thanks for listening today. I hope I was able to illustrate some of the features of our class with my experience as a U.S. Army officer. Take care. I hope you all have a Merry Christmas.